Welcome friends, welcome back to the kitchen. Today we're going to do a recipe that I have pushed aside for a very long time. We're going to make a beef bourguignon. And the reason I've pushed this aside for so long is that the mythology around this recipe, people's ideas of what this recipe is much larger than what the recipe actually is. People have sort of romanticized this recipe to the point where it's something that goes back thousands of years unchanged, unaltered. When the reality is, the earliest recipe that we can find, that was butter that I'm putting in the bottom of this Dutch oven, and this is bacon. The earliest written recipe that I've been able to look at is 1903. And that recipe was written by Escoffier. And it called for a whole beef roast that you marinated for 6 hours with bacon in cognac and then sort of did this recipe. So it's a little bit different than what people sort of agree on today as beef bourguignon. And the other people say, well, this goes back to the Middle Ages. It's this really old recipe. Everyone in France knew how to make it. And I kind of get that because it is a very simple sort of country style recipe. In with the bacon and the butter, I've got these sort of pearl onions that are peeled but not cut open. They go in, about a dozen of those. It is a very simple recipe. But in this stack of French cookbooks from the mid-1800s all the way back to the 1700s, there is not one beef recipe that contains all of these ingredients. There is not one beef recipe that uses red wine. Red wine is the signature of beef bourguignon. So if this was a very popular and widespread recipe going back to the Middle Ages, you would expect it to show up in at least one of these extremely famous French cookbooks from the 1700s and 1800s. As a side note, in the 1700s and 1800s, all of the beef recipes, all of the beef stew recipes, you're cooking it in white wine, not red wine, white wine, always white wine, or vinegar, or verjus. Never in red wine. And I find that very interesting because it goes against everything that today we think of cooking with wine or pairing wine with meat. Obviously, red meat, you're going to use red wine. Just doesn't happen in the written history. So I'm supposed to cook this until the bacon is brown and the onions are starting to brown, but not at a very high temperature. Oh, and so the recipe that we're doing today is written by Paul Bocuse. Paul Bocuse is legend in French cooking. If Escoffier was a legend, Paul Bocuse is another legend in French cooking. There isn't a chef alive today who is even qualified to scrub Paul Bocuse's pots. And I'm serious about that. Paul Bocuse was the real deal. So, I'm just going to continue until this is browned off a little bit more. Okay, that's coming along nicely. So next I'm going to put some salt and pepper on the beef. And you might not see it because I'll probably edit it out, but I will toss this beef around and make sure I get salt and pepper all over it. Now, against every instinct that I have in the kitchen about browning beef in a pot, where you put in just a few at a time and brown them. Don't overcrowd the pot. You don't want to steam the beef. You want to brown it, quickly sear it. The recipe by Paul Bocuse says to stick it all in and brown it all, and that the browning process should take you half an hour, 30 minutes at least. So who am I to argue with one of the, if not the, greatest French chef ever? It all goes into the pot. Now the beef is browning up amazingly. We're about 25 minutes and I think it looks almost done. I'm gonna get the bouquet garni done and ready for the next step. So, onions and carrots are the only vegetables in this stew. So I've got the carrots ready to go in a couple of steps from now. The bouquet garni is just a couple of ribs of celery, some thyme, and parsley, and 1 bay leaf. So I'll just tie this up so that it's easier to pull out at the end. And we'll pull everything out of this pot. And as you can see, amazing amount of browning on this. And there's a lot of fat in the bottom of this pot. Now the recipe says to skim off some of the fat as you feel necessary. Between the butter and what was left from the bacon, I think I'm going to have to take some fat out. And it really depends on, I guess, the bacon that you use. If you've got a really fatty section of bacon, you're probably going to have to take some fat out. So I'm going to pull that out next. And then into the bottom of the pot, I've got some flour, and that goes in. And we just stir the flour around, mix it in with the drippings, and cook it until it starts to brown a little bit. This is one of the situations where we do want some browning from the flour. Now, once we've got a little bit of browning, I'm going to put in some tomato paste. About that much. And we'll stir that in to the flour and the fat and cook it just a little bit. Now, I'm going to change from a wooden spoon to a whisk, and we start drizzling in the red wine and whisking it in little by little. Now, your selection of wine for this is pretty important. Wine, in this case, is the major flavor component for the dish. So choosing the right one is super important. Choosing a wine that you like is super important. This dish that I'm making today takes an entire bottle of red wine. And the early recipes that I've seen for beef bourguignon don't specify even the color of the wine that you're supposed to use. You're just supposed to use a Burgundy. So it could be a white wine. And in a lot of cases, it might have been early on. They might have been using a white wine from Burgundy. So a red wine from Burgundy is generally Pinot Noir. So I'm using a Pinot Noir. I'm using a Pinot Noir that I like to drink. If you wanted to use a white Burgundy, I think historically that could be correct. And you could either use one from Burgundy or you could use a Chardonnay, since whites from Burgundy are overwhelmingly Chardonnay. Just make sure you like it. Really, that's what it comes down to. So I'm supposed to keep adding the wine slowly and whisking until I've got a nice smooth sauce. And I think we've got a nice smooth sauce. I'm going to pour it all in now because we're smooth and there's no risk of breaking that sauce. Okay. Next up, I've got some garlic. In that goes. In go the carrots. The bouquet garni. And the beef, bacon, and onions go back in. And I'll give that a bit of a stir. Now, the Paul Bocuse recipe gives you a couple of options at this point. Put the lid on and leave it on the stovetop, cooking gently for 3.5 hours. Or stick it in the oven 300, 325 for the same amount of time, and then take it out and it'll be ready to eat. There are footnotes, of course, that say the longer it cooks, the better it will be. So I'm probably going to let that go at 325 for 4 or 5 hours. See you back here for the tasting. Look at that color. Okay, so out comes the bouquet garni. It's done its job. Okay, so I'm just gonna give it a little bit of a stir.
Hey, Glenn.
Hey,
hey
Jules.
friends.
Fork or spoon. I don't know.
You've got the potatoes there to soak it up. Whatever it is, it looks like a stew.
It is kind of a stew. It is beef bourguignon.
Oh, so it's,
But
stew with a name.
it is a stew with a name. But I mean,
It's going to be good, though. Oh, that means there should be wine, which I see over here.
Yes, well, the wine is
go
in
with
it.
it.
So this took an entire bottle of wine.
So there's no wine for drinking?
There's no wine for drinking. We'll have to work.
Okay, so
We'll have
first
to
of all,
open
there's
another
my
one.
first issue with beef bourguignon.
We'll have to open a second
Okay.
bottle. Now, you saw me make this. It's simple. It is the most basic of stews. And I'm going to try a little bit without the potatoes. We've got mashed potatoes in the bowl.
Yeah, but it's pretty darn good. You know,
That's a massive amount of flavor. It's deep, it's rich. It's got all of those dark tones that you want from a warming beef winter stew. It's amazing.
the carrot's really hot.
Okay, so beef bourguignon, the actual recipe called beef bourguignon, doesn't show up until it shows up in this book, Larousse Gastronomique, 1867. It doesn't show up in a recipe, a cooking recipe book, until 1903. And so, as I said earlier, it's not that old of a recipe, and it doesn't have to be that drawn-out 4-day-long process that some people make it into.
Ooh, how does Julia make it?
Julia does something very much like this. Very
you
sort
know.
of simple, basic. It's meant to be food eaten in the countryside.
Yeah.
It's not haute cuisine. It really is
Food.
bourgeoisie.
Oh!
You know? And so, as I said earlier, you go back in these cookbooks from the 1800s and the 1700s, French cooking, you're not cooking beef with red wine, you're cooking with white wine. So, sort of, you know, keep that in mind when you're talking about tradition. Tradition changes, and old traditions are forgotten about.
Fair enough.
So, you know, make this stew and add other things to it.
Make it your tradition. Mm-hmm. There you go.
That's amazing, though. I'm really enjoying this. Thanks for stopping by. See you again soon.